Next up is Mark Wilson. Mark Wilson is in his 6th year as the Player Development Director in the PGA Golf Management Program at Ferris State University. Prior to this, he served 31 years as the head golf professional at Watermark Country Club in Grand Rapids. In 2017, he worked his 28th PGA Championship in August and was chief referee for the 2016 Ryder Cup. He's also officiated at 20 Masters tournaments, 7 Open Championships, 5 U.S. Opens, and 9 Ryder Cups. In 2007, he was elected to the Michigan Golf Hall of Fame. In 2008, the Grand Rapids Michigan Sports Hall of Fame. And in 2011, became one of 12 original inductees to the Michigan PGA Hall of Fame. Please welcome Mark Wilson.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here for this presentation this morning. And I know I was talking to Jim. Everybody's happy. There's just a little snow on the ground. That makes it a little easier to sit through the meeting and not have to worry about anything. My presentation this morning is going to focus on the proposed new rules of golf changes for 2019. I'll certainly be happy to answer any questions that you have about the current rules, but some of you are probably aware that starting back probably as early as 2010, the USGA and the R&A started to discuss what has become a major reorganization and rewriting to the rules of golf. Over time, there certainly are milestones in the history of the rules. The early 1950s, where the USGA and the R&A agreed on a uniform code. 1984 was a pretty significant revision to the rules of golf, but this will be big for those of you who've worked with the rules at all for a number of reasons. One, because the rules book will be completely reorganized, and secondly, unlike 1984, almost every word in the rules book will be different than it is right now. The transformation in terms of what's taken place is really pretty remarkable from a standpoint of what the two governing bodies set out to do, from a standpoint of really modernizing the rules so that they might be easier for people to actually read and understand. So, and some of you may have taken a look at some of these things and be familiar with a little bit of it. Technically, the USGA is going to have a formal announcement probably sometime next week regarding what the final outcome is here. Again, for those of you maybe who followed the process, the governing bodies about 1 year ago announced this proposed new set of rules and then had a comment period that ran from last March till August. And then at the end of the comment period from August until now, the USGA and the R&A have been working on the comments that they received to put this into this final version. And like I say, I think they're planning on an announcement next week. So there are probably a few things this morning that I know, but I'm not allowed to tell you yet. But I'll give you some hints. And in any case, like I say, this will be pretty significant. So what I wanted to do this morning was just take a look at a dozen or so of them. Some will impact your golf games, and some will impact your course marking or course setups. And so I think you'll find some of these to be interesting. The governing bodies have sort of put these changes in categories. So for example, in one category, changes to concepts regarding your ball in play and at rest. So for example, proposed change, and again, I think this is pretty likely to take place when they make this announcement next week, for a ball move during search. So here's a player who's searching for his ball. He doesn't know where it is, can't find it, and you've all certainly encountered this situation on the course. And probably you all know at this point that currently, if this player causes his own ball at rest to move in either match play or stroke play, he's going to get a one-stroke penalty and have to replace the ball. The proposed change would provide for no penalty if a player accidentally moves his or her ball while searching for it, and the ball would be replaced. And if the exact spot of the ball isn't known, what will happen in the proposed change is that the spot will be estimated and the ball will be placed in the estimated spot. In other words, if it's deep in the grass or if it's up against an object or a branch or something like that, the ball will be placed in the estimated spot. Currently, if the player doesn't know the spot where the ball is to be replaced, the player estimates, but the player drops it. So some of the reasons for the proposed change is that, first of all, the rules, sort of fundamentally, as you all know, require the player, for the most part, to play the ball as it lies. And so certainly it's important for the player to be able to find this ball that they play as it lies. And often players need to search, obviously, in long grass, bushes, other conditions for a hidden ball. I think currently some of you are probably aware that the only situations where you can search for a ball, move it, and not be penalized is if your ball is buried in sand, either in a bunker or in a sandy area through the green. And you're also not penalized if you're probing for your ball that's in water, in a water hazard, and you cause it to move. But that's a pretty rare search occasion. So right now there are limited times when you're not penalized in searching. This would certainly broaden that. I think, again, if you just relate this to your own play, it is sort of an oddity in the rules that currently everybody else that you're playing with is sort of encouraged to search for your ball, but because you risk a penalty for searching, what do you usually do? You kind of hold back, don't you, and you let everybody else search. But who has the most vested interest in finding the ball? Well, you do. And so, again, this change to the rule would allow you to be able to search a little more aggressively. But as this paragraph says, certainly not so aggressively that you're going to breach rules where you might improve the area of your intended swing or the lie of your ball or your stance by breaking things excessively and so forth. Again, this concept of if the location of the ball isn't known, in other words, perhaps the player kicks the ball and causes it to move and doesn't know exactly where it was. Currently, as we say, the player is replacing it by dropping it, but this often results in the ball being replaced in a place that's really not similar to where the ball is lying. Most of you know when a player drops a ball, it can strike the ground and then roll somewhere. So it might roll from the rough to the fairway, for example, and currently that would be okay as long as it didn't roll more than 2 club lengths or roll closer to the hole. But in this case now, the estimation of the spot and the replacement of the ball on that estimated spot will ensure that players are continuing play from a situation that would be more similar to where their ball originally lay. So ball moved during search. Secondly, and some of you may have been familiar with this with respect to local rules that they've implemented on the tours, and also some of you may have implemented this local rule at your clubs or courses. And if you haven't, I would suggest that you do, because you've got one more year where you can do this. And that's this special local rule, currently local rule, that would be codified in 2019 for no penalty for accidental movement of a ball on the putting green. I think, again, currently, as most of you know, if this local rule isn't in effect that you could be using right now, if a player, for example, drops their putter on their ball on the putting green, or is going to mark the ball and they reach down, they accidentally kick the ball and cause it to move, or, for example, they might even drop their coin on top of the ball and cause it to move. In all those situations, currently, a player would be penalized 1 stroke and would have to replace the ball. Starting in 2019, or if you want to, again, implement this local rule right now, any accidental movement of a ball on the putting green would result in no penalty. So in a similar situation, if the local rule's in effect now, or starting January 1, if you drop your putter on the ball, kick your ball, or somehow otherwise accidentally cause it to move on the putting green, you're not penalized and the ball is replaced. Now, Under the current local rule, if you implement it, or starting January 1, there is still a penalty for purposeful movement or touching of your ball on the putting green. So for example, if for some reason you're not thinking and you forget to mark your ball and you lift it, in any case, you're still going to get a one-stroke penalty for doing that, because that's not accidental movement of the ball, that's some sort of purposeful movement. And so, as I say, no penalty, either if you implement the local rule now or if you wait till January 1. Again, you're all agronomists, you know that over the years, the condition, shape, slope of many putting greens increases the risk or chance of balls moving on the putting green. And I think, as some of you have seen, especially even at high levels, it's often difficult to determine what the cause of the movement of the ball is. In other words, did the player cause the ball to move? Was it gravity that caused the ball to move? And so forth. And certainly, again, you've seen high-profile situations. Dustin Johnson at the U.S. Open a couple of years ago, for example. And so the governing bodies have essentially said, you know, most of this movement activity that's taken place, again, if you think about Dustin Johnson, what was he trying to do? Make a couple practice swings near his ball? And, you know, the question is, hey, did he cause the ball to move? Well, this will sort of mitigate that from a standpoint of, even if he did, he would no longer be penalized for that. And again, most of this movement takes place when players are simply preparing to make strokes, addressing the ball, making practice swings near their ball, and so forth. Again, in the discussion, the governing bodies have said, you know, for the most part, this movement is minimal. In other words, the ball might move a few inches, can easily be retrieved and replaced. But importantly, in this last paragraph, again, the discussion is that although special conditions exist on the putting green, where there's going to be a provision for no penalty, in other areas of the course, for example, through the green, the fairway and the rough, by the way, that term will now be called general area. If you want to get a head start on your golf definitions, that's going to be called the general area, that part of the course that's now the fairway and the rough. But players still need to be careful in those areas of the course, in hazards. They need to be careful so that they don't cause their ball to move, because this exception would only apply on the putting green. We talked about this a little bit in terms of the searching for the ball and a player accidentally moving their ball during the search and not being penalized. To broaden the concept now, effective 2019, anytime a player's ball at rest is moved and the spot is not known, the player will now still estimate the spot and place the ball on the estimated spot. Again, as we discussed, currently, in all situations except on the putting green, if a player's ball at rest is moved, regardless of the cause, in other words, if an outside agency moves the ball, if an opponent in match play moves the ball, if a spectator moves the ball, in any of those cases now, the ball is replaced, but again, if the player doesn't know the spot, they're dropping it in order to replace it, except on the putting green where they're placing it. So that in 2019, players will always be estimating the spot where the ball was moved and placing it on that estimated spot. And again, we discussed some of these considerations. A few other concepts that the governing bodies discussed. You know, when a player marks the position of their ball and lifts it, they know the location that it has to be returned to, and it's always returned to that spot. And so, likewise, in some of the discussion, the thought is, anytime a ball in play that's moved and has to be replaced should be treated in sort of that same way as it would be as if it were marked. In other words, try to get it back as nearly as possible to where it was. Again, for some of the reasons that we discussed, because in the dropping situations, if the spot isn't known, oftentimes the ball might end up, instead of being down deep in the grass where it was originally, it might end up on top of the grass, might end up striking the course and rolling somewhere else, so that it's often not played anywhere near the location that it was originally when it's moved. And then, again, in this rules modernization process, since the procedure currently, when your ball at rest is moved on the putting green, the ball is always going to be replaced by placing it. So this concept really just broadens that to the entire rest of the golf course, that any time your ball at rest is moved and has to be replaced, it will be placed on the estimated spot. All right, number of changes to relief procedures. New procedure for dropping a ball, and some of you may have heard about this. I think this is one of the most sort of widely discussed of the proposed changes that were announced. And this is something that you may have to wait until next week to find out exactly how it will be resolved. Obviously, all of you know that the current rule requires the player himself to stand erect, hold the ball at shoulder height and arm's length, and drop it. And certainly over the years, in my rules lifetime, there have been a lot of discussions between the two governing bodies about, you know, it would be a lot simpler if when proceeding under situations where you always had to do this, where you could simply place the ball. In other words, place it every time, place it. And I think for a while the USGA really thought they might be able to embrace that concept, but the R&A never could quite get their arms around it. You know, it was always my sense that the R&A really always liked a little bit of that element of risk or uncertainty about where that ball would bounce and roll to after it struck the ground. And so the two governing bodies couldn't really quite ever reach an agreement on this concept of universally being able to place a ball when a player takes relief. And if you think about it, from a standpoint of time and simplicity, it would make things a lot simpler. You take relief from a lateral water hazard, for example, measure 2 club lengths, just get right down by the ground and place your ball and go, right? Instead of having to drop it and maybe have it roll into the hazard, somebody has to retrieve it or your caddy has to catch it and so forth, would make things a lot simpler. Well, in any case, they just couldn't quite get to that place point. And so they are still working on what ultimately is going to happen here. And so, like I say, you may have to wait until next week. What was originally announced last March was language that would say that it would be acceptable to drop a ball from any height, which would simply mean that the ball had to be released just some distance, some small distance above the ground, above the grass, above a bush, or whatever it was that the ball was going to strike. And as the discussion went along, this much I can tell you, as the discussion went along, there started to be questions about, well, would players get so close to the ground that then there would be disputes about whether or not a player had really dropped the ball from any height, or had the player gotten so close to the ground that they simply had placed it, which would be a breach of the rules. And so that didn't seem to work very well. Some of the tours objected to sort of the look of players releasing balls from this height. They just didn't think it looked that great. And so there's a lot of considerations in the comment period and also following the comment period as the governing bodies have talked about this. So I think what you'll end up seeing is they certainly are looking for a simplified procedure, and they're looking for a situation where players will be able to do this a little more easily, but also to have balls end up being dropped where they'll stay in the location that they're supposed to stay without the need for necessarily several redrops or a drop in place, so that players can move along. And so what I think you'll end up seeing next week is some height that's below your waist, but I'm not sure where at this point, and I'm not sure quite how it will be defined. But again, the focus in this change is to eliminate the mechanical approach of the drop. The player, him or herself, will still have to do this. Again, they still want to maintain a little bit of this randomness of where the ball might end up instead of in the placing situation. The biggest drawback to the place was it seemed like, well, the player was always going to get the best lie possible by placing it. And so they just couldn't quite come to grips with that. But again, by eliminating the drop from shoulder height, certainly balls won't roll as far as they currently do now if they're dropped from somewhere closer to the ground. In other words, in this kind of a space or perhaps closer, they certainly will not roll quite as far, and that will be a pace of play consideration. Now, this is important, this dropping procedure is important because it's sort of a companion to another really significant change in the rule, and that is now, and again, you're going to have to wait till next week to find out exactly what these relief areas are going to be, but the new proposed change now, along with the new dropping procedure, is going to require all the drop balls not only be dropped in whatever the relief area is, but that in order to be in play, they have to stay in the relief area. So what do I mean by that? Let me take a simple example. I don't know how the measurement issue is going to work out. Some of you may be aware. Were some of you aware that the discussion was they were going to go to the situation where you were going to measure either 20 inches or 80 inches? Any of you hear that? Yeah, some of you are nodding your head. Wait till next week, but I don't think it's going to be 20 and 80. So I can't tell you exactly what it is going to be, but I don't think they're going to go to the 20 and 80. In the comment period, it just wasn't something that the golfing world seemed to embrace. But in any case, let me take a current example. When you take relief from a lateral water hazard, one of the options is that you measure 2 club lengths from the margin of the lateral water hazard, from where the ball last crossed the margin of the lateral water hazard, and you drop the ball. A lot of you may want to drop it as far as you can away from the hazard, so you drop it as close as you can to the end of the second club length. And currently, if the ball strikes a part of the course where it's supposed to, in real close to the end of that second club length, I think most of you know that once it strikes the course, it can roll up to 2 more club lengths before it has to be redropped, which effectively means that in that situation, a player could end up almost 4 club lengths from where the ball last crossed the margin of the lateral water hazard. Well, now what will happen is that in any relief situation, the ball will not only have to be dropped in the prescribed area, but it will have to stay there as well. So this 2 club lengths from the margin of the lateral water hazard, you'll still have to drop the ball in the 2 club length area, and it will have to stay in the 2 club length area. If it doesn't stay in the 2 club length area, this much I can tell you, it will have to be redropped, in other words, 1 more time, and if it doesn't stay there again, so this will be pretty similar to the current rule. If it doesn't stay there the second time, it will have to be placed where it first struck a part of the course on the second drop. Now, one thing that this does do is it does make dropping simpler from this standpoint. Whatever the prescribed area is, let's say it's 2 club lengths in the case of the lateral water hazard. In other cases, what I think you're going to see is you're going to see a broadened scope in terms of where balls can be dropped. So, for example, let's take the cases like the stroke and distance cases. From the fairway, you hit your ball out of bounds. What do you have to do right now? You have to come back to the spot of the previous stroke and drop it as nearly as possible to that spot. What I think you're going to see next week is that that area will be expanded, and it could be as big as 1 club length from the spot of the previous stroke. So can't drop it closer to the hole, but you'll have a slightly bigger area to drop it in than you do right now. You know, there's quite a lot of precision required when you have to drop it at the spot of the previous stroke. So that area will be expanded a little bit. But again, the point is the ball will have to stay in that area. Well, what will that do? I think one other thing you'll see too, similar. How about an embedded ball? And we've got to change to the embedded ball rule. What are you doing right now? You're trying to drop the ball as nearly as possible to where that ball was embedded. And again, I think you'll see that that area where the ball can be dropped broadened. You'll never be able to drop it closer to the hole, but you'll be able to drop it in a bigger area. Again, I don't think it's going to be a 20-inch area or an 80-inch area. I think it's going to be measured differently. But in any case, this will simplify the dropping procedure in this regard. If you think about it right now, if you look at Rule 20-2C, this is what you see on television a lot, where tour players drop a ball and it rolls somewhere, they drop it again and it rolls somewhere, and they place it. Well, there's 9 times in this Rule 20-2C where players have to redrop balls. For example, a ball rolls into a hazard, rolls out of a hazard, rolls onto a putting green, rolls out of bounds, more than 2 club lengths from where it first struck a part of the course, and so forth. Well, now a player won't have to remember all those 9 times in Rule 20-2C. All they'll have to remember is that if it stays in the area where it was dropped originally, it's going to be in play, unless it would roll into, for example, a hazard, let's say. So then it would have to be redropped. But otherwise, if it stays in that area, the player can go ahead and play. So it will certainly simplify, as this says, these 9 redropping scenarios that currently exist. If the ball comes to rest outside the relief area, the player just knows now they're going to have to redrop the ball. Time search for a lost ball. Some of you, this was a little publicized. Some of you may have heard this, and I think this is you're going to hear this next week. This is pretty certain, that the time for search for a lost ball will be reduced to 3 minutes from 5 minutes. And again, I think that that's pretty certain to take place. What are some of the concepts? Well, governing bodies are interested in doing anything they can to improve the pace of play, and certainly this will add an element to it, consistent with the underlying principle in the rules of golf that golf be played in a prompt and continuous way. Total delay for a lost ball now, as you know, can be a lot longer than the 5-minute period that you're allowed for search. Players search for balls. Somebody that can't find their ball has to walk back to the spot of the previous stroke and play again, and then walk forward to wherever that new ball has come to rest. And so in most cases, that takes a lot longer than 5 minutes. Most of you have experienced this. It really does seem like if a ball isn't found in 3 minutes, it's really very rarely found. In other words, usually you might search for a minute, minute and a half, and you probably find it. And if you don't, generally you don't find it after that period of time. And so what the governing bodies decided was, in most cases, that extra search period isn't really used very productively anyway, as most of those balls are never found. Certainly, there may be an increase in the number of lost balls, and that's a possibility, but I guess the governing bodies are willing to concede that, given that they're hoping for a better pace of play and more sort of continuous play in terms of concepts. And hopefully, players will also be encouraged and think about playing a provisional ball if they think that their ball might be lost, and go ahead and play a provisional ball before they go forward to search, knowing that once they go forward, they only have 3 minutes. Again, though it's not a big change, one of the minor changes that will take place is this concept of play of a provisional ball. Essentially, you'll be able to announce and properly play a provisional ball at any time prior to your original ball being found. I think, as most of you know currently, if you go forward to search for your original ball, you cannot come back and play a provisional ball. If you do, that's not a provisional ball. That's your ball in play under penalty of stroke and distance. And so this relaxed rule where maybe you'll walk forward and see, or perhaps your partner or caddies have started to search, and you realize, well, you know what, I'll let them search and I'll walk back and play a provisional ball, and that will be acceptable. Again, given that what happens next week is, I think what will happen is that you'll be able to properly announce and play a provisional ball anytime prior to the finding of your original ball. Substitution of a ball. will always be allowed when a player's taking relief. I think most of you are certainly aware that currently substitution of a ball is limited to penalty situations currently during the play of a hole, unless you substitute because your ball is unfit for play. So if your ball is unplayable, or you hit your ball in a water hazard, or it's out of bounds, currently you can substitute. But when you take relief from an abnormal ground condition, for example, ground under repair or casual water, you can't substitute. If you take relief from an obstruction, you cannot substitute. And so now, anytime a player would be able to take relief, free relief, or penalty relief, the player would be able to substitute a new ball during the play of a hole. So this eliminates some of the inconsistency in terms of players dropping balls and wondering, can I substitute in this situation? The only time a player would be prohibited from substituting during play of a hole would be in situations where their ball had to be replaced on the spot from which it was lifted or moved. So for example, if in 2019, if you're asked to lift your ball because it interferes with another player's play in the fairway, when you lift that ball, it has to be replaced on the spot from which it was lifted, so you could not substitute. When you lift your ball on the putting green, obviously you replace your ball on the putting green from the spot it was lifted, and you would not be able to substitute. If your ball at rest is moved in 2019 and has to be replaced, then you would not be able to substitute. But essentially, any time where you're dropping the ball in some place other than the original location of the ball, you'd be able to substitute. And so it should be a little bit easier for players to sort this out. Again, the thinking of the governing bodies is that there's no fundamental reason to separate out differences between penalty situations and non-penalty situations. And so it may be able to draw a little more clear and intuitive line in terms of being able to substitute any time the player isn't putting the ball back on its original spot. Again, this should be something that simplifies things. And I think, too, as most of you know, the current construction of modern balls, really substitution is probably not an issue because the condition of the ball hardly changes during the play of a hole. It takes an awful lot to cut a ball or really cause significant damage to a ball. Although that procedure will still be provided for in the rules, for a ball that's visibly cut or cracked, that ball could still be replaced during play of a hole. Relief for an embedded ball. You know, we've become so used to in the United States under the USGA's jurisdiction to playing with the local rule in effect. For example, for a ball that's embedded anywhere through the green, in other words, in the fairway or the rough. All of the governing bodies in the United States, major governing bodies, have used this local rule from Appendix 1 in their tournaments, and I assume most of you do at your clubs and courses. So we've just sort of taken it as a matter of course that, well, of course, if your ball is embedded in the rough, you get relief, right? Well, the rule doesn't say that. The rule, as it's written, Rule 25.2, currently, under the rules of golf, only provides for relief for an embedded ball that's embedded in a closely mown area through the green. In other words, and defined in the rules book as closely mown area being any part of the course cut to fairway height or less. So this new rule will be a flip to what the current local rule is. Now, the R&A have continued to play with the rule from the rules book. So, for example, if you play in the Open Championship and your ball is embedded in its own pitch mark in the rough, you don't get free relief. In fact, officials have made mistakes giving players. I know an official, I felt bad for him, gave Phil Mickelson embedded ball relief at the Open Championship, I don't remember, maybe about 10 years ago, and I just thought, well, I felt bad for the official because they're so used to, on all the world tours, to granting that embedded ball relief through the green. Well, this official made a mistake, because if you play over there in the UK or play in the Open Championship, they limit the relief to the areas of the course cut to fairway height or less. Well, Now, what will happen in 2019, again, like I say, is a flip of that. So the whole world will play like we've been under the rules, except there will be a provision where committees can institute a local rule that would go back to the way the R&A does it right now. So if the R&A wants to continue this, and I suspect they do for the Open Championship, in other words, denying embedded ball relief in the rough, that they'll have to implement the local rule. So this will be good for us because we're used to this. And again, a lot of the rationale for this is, first of all, it's appropriate under the rules to provide relief for a ball that's stuck in soft or wet ground, whether it's in the fairway or the rough. And that really shouldn't be considered part of the normal challenge of the game. One other comment that I thought was really pertinent, and I'm not sure why, it was always an impediment to the R&A wanting to adopt this as a rule, because it's certainly been discussed with them for a long time. If you think about it, again, this part of the course that we call through the green, which is, again, this area of the fairway and the rough, well, in other relief situations currently and in 2019, those parts of the course are treated the same. In other words, if you drop your ball in the fairway and it rolls into the rough, it's in play, or vice versa. And if you have a sprinkler head in the fairway, you get relief, don't you? And if you have a sprinkler head in the rough, you get relief. If you have casual water in the fairway, you get relief. If you have casual water in the rough, and so forth, you get relief. And so providing relief for an embedded ball in those areas of the course, the fairway and the rough, seems to make sense as it relates to other free relief procedures. So again, and the other discussion is that this was so broadly used throughout the world that when it wasn't, most people were confused by it and certainly resulted in some unnecessary penalties. And so this flip of the default position hopefully will eliminate the confusion that exists when players haven't realized that a club or course didn't institute the local rule. Okay, some changes to areas of the course, and these will be significant for some of you as well. Not so much necessarily this one, but a couple of them coming up. When to replace a ball that moves on the putting green. Essentially what this will say starting in 2019 is that once a player has marked, lifted, and replaced their ball on the putting green, regardless of the cause of the movement of that ball will now be replaced. So whether it's moved by a player accidentally, it'll be replaced, which is certainly the case now. But more importantly, once that ball is marked, lifted, and replaced, if it's moved by wind or gravity or water, it will also be replaced. And again, some of you are familiar with situations. There was a situation 5 years or so ago on the LPGA Tour in a strong wind where a player had marked, lifted, and replaced their ball on the putting green, and the wind was so strong, this huge gust came up. All of a sudden it blew the ball and it blew it into a water hazard. Some of you recall a couple of years ago a similar situation happened at the Masters on the 15th hole. There's certainly been a lot of balls at rest that have moved after they've been replaced by the wind or by gravity. And so some of the reasons for change are just that currently, if you think about it, when your ball is at rest, let's say other than on the putting green, as a result of a stroke, if it moves somewhere, if gravity moves it somewhere, well, we take that as sort of a continuation of the previous stroke, and we wouldn't really think of picking up our ball and putting it down. Or even on the putting green, if you hit an approach shot from 150 yards away and the ball lands on the top tier of the green, you might walk 50 yards forward and the ball's just sitting there, and all of a sudden you're still walking, and now the ball starts to move, and it rolls and rolls and rolls off the putting green. Well, when you get there, you don't pick it up and put it back. Again, that's sort of a continuation of the previous stroke. But now, once you've marked, lifted, and replaced your ball on the putting green, there doesn't quite seem to be this connection to the result of the previous stroke. And so the rules writers have decided that, you know, sometimes these outcomes don't really seem fair. A player has already now marked, lifted, and replaced, and the wind blows the ball into a bunker, blows it off the putting green. In some cases, it's blown the ball into the hole, and in that case, the ball was considered a hole, which won't be the case in 2019. But it seems like, for the most part, the outcomes have been more bad than they've been good, and so on balance, it seems like this is probably a good idea. So now, anytime, again, starting January 1, once the ball is marked, lifted, and replaced, if it moves somewhere on the putting green, it's going to be replaced. Repairing damage on the putting green. Obviously, there's a lot less damage than there once was when players were wearing metal spikes. It's been a long time since that's been the case, except on the tours, where a few players do still wear metal spikes. Tiger Woods is one of them. But there aren't very many. It's interesting, you know, the younger golfers have grown up not wearing them, and so when they go to play the tours, they mostly don't wear them. But currently, I think most of you know that under the rules, you're permitted to do what? Remove sand and loose soil from the putting green, and you're also permitted to repair damage in a limited way. Damage made by the impact of a ball and also an old hole plug. Well, now this will be broadened to any sort of damage. In other words, the shoe damage that you see here, animal damage, animal hoof prints, for example, other scuff marks, damage caused by the flagstick on the putting green. But specifically not provided for here would be, for example, aeration holes. A player would not be able to repair aeration holes. A player would not be able to repair verticutting grooves. A player would also not be able to repair any natural imperfections or defects, such as a bare area or a diseased area, or surface around the hole that was just worn as a result of normal use. Again, what's the thinking here? Well, putting greens have become so super specially prepared that players, again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, players have come to expect perfection, haven't they? 365 days of the year they expect it, and so this will allow them to provide a little of it for themselves. As we mentioned, currently some of the things that you can do, so this sort of just broadens the scope of what they can do, and in many cases, some of this damage might be treated, currently, if there was a referee available, might be treated as ground under repair. The animal hoof print damage, for example. A referee might say, well, hey, this is ground under repair, and we'll go ahead and give you relief. Well, now, there won't be that need. A player will simply be able to repair that damage and go ahead and play on. And so this certainly will assist players in being able to play. Certainly some discussion has taken place about, you know, will players spend excessive time trying to repair some of this damage? There's a specific provision in the language of the rule that says that they can't create some sort of special pathway to the hole, and other considerations regarding pace of play should, the rules writers are hoping, prevent unnecessary delay in terms of what repair takes place. So I hope that will be the case, but I guess we'll find out. Here's one that will take some getting used to, and that is being able to play with the flagstick in the hole. This is primarily designed to be a pace of play change, and so players will have the option from the putting green of being able to putt with the flagstick in the hole, and there will be no penalty for the player's ball striking the flagstick. The result will simply be the result. In other words, if the ball strikes the flagstick and goes into the hole, the ball will be holed with no penalty. If the ball strikes the flagstick and deflects away, then the ball will simply be played as it lies. Players will still have the option of having the flagstick attended if they would like, and in that case, the flagstick needs to be removed as it traditionally has been, but accidental striking of the flagstick or the flagstick attendant, if it's accidental, will result in no penalty effective January 2019. So again, this is a pretty big change. Some of you recall there was a limited period of time in the early 1960s when a player was penalized for striking the flagstick anywhere that was closer to the hole than 60 feet. And that was really awkward, but it was in effect for a short period of time. But that also meant that there were certain long putts that players could putt where they could putt with the flagstick in the hole. And there's an old episode of Shell's Wonderful World of Golf at Pine Valley with Gene Littler hitting one of those long putts with the flagstick in the hole because he was farther than 60 feet from the hole. That rule was only in effect for a limited time, and believe me, it created a lot of awkward controversy because players might play a bunker shot that was inside of 60 feet and strike the flagstick and then be penalized. So it created a lot of arguments. But in any case, we won't have to worry about that now. So this is designed primarily as a speed of play issue, and not only to be able to leave it in the hole if you want for a pace of play, but if you do think about it, if players don't have caddies, which is certainly often the case, let's say there's a singles match, so player A is playing player B, and they both have really long putts. Well, somebody's got to go up and tend that flag. You've got to figure out who's away, then somebody's got to walk way up and tend the flagstick, then that person has to walk way back, and then the other person walks way up, and so forth. Maybe somebody's raking a bunker, and you really need them to tend the flagstick. And so all of those considerations will be eliminated because you can hit those long putts with the flagstick in the hole. I think, too, that you're going to see, that may be of interest to you, that somebody is going to come up with, one of your manufacturers is going to come up with a flagstick that's got a smaller diameter at the bottom of the flagstick. You know that currently the rule requires that diameter in the last 6 inches be what? Half an inch is the most it can be. But there's no minimum diameter to it. And so I think you're going to find some manufacturers that are going to probably, so people will be calling on. Anybody seen that or heard about that yet? No? I think you're going to see it. Somebody will call on you with a flagstick that's got a real small diameter at the bottom so that there's more room for that ball to go into the hole. So see if that doesn't happen. I think it probably will. To come along with this rule. Okay, here's one that will affect you. Committees marking what are called penalty areas. So the concept of a water hazard or lateral water hazard is going to go away. There will no longer be water hazards and lateral water hazards. In fact, the word hazard will be eliminated from the rules of golf. There will be bunkers, which are still bunkers, and there will be penalty areas. And penalty areas will be expanded in this way. And some clubs and courses are doing this now. Penalty areas will include areas that we consider currently to be water hazards or lateral water hazards. So there will still be the red and yellow color codes. But these areas will be expanded as they are in some other parts of the world to include desert areas, jungle areas, lava rock areas, and so forth. And again, we'll continue to use the red and yellow coloring, but the term hazard won't be used. So what's the rationale here? Well, it's been certainly recognized by the governing bodies that requiring areas to contain water seems to be a little bit arbitrary. And so for safety reasons and pace of play, committees on their own have sought to expand the use, especially of red areas. Certainly, I'm sure you're all familiar with places that mark areas red right now that really don't have the nature of a lateral water hazard. There's no water. There might be a heavy wooded area, it might be an area where there's cactus or a steep drop-off or something like that. So this change in 2019, as this says, this broader use of penalty areas, will now allow committees to respond to the wide range of settings in which golf is played by giving relief from areas that present similar obstacles to existing water areas hazards, such as difficulties with finding and playing a ball. So right now, it's a heavily wooded area, for example, or if you're in Florida, an area with a lot of thick foliage, palmetto bushes and a lot of undergrowth. All those areas, committees will have the authority now to mark them as red, and instead of having to either not define them or define them as through the green or define them as out of bounds. And again, this is going to be up to individual committees to decide what to do. Really, my understanding would be this, is that, currently, if you have a situation on your course where you have a boundary with a chain link fence, and then there's a road that's adjacent to it, that should remain as a boundary. That would be out of bounds. But if you have that area of your course that has a small lateral water hazard, and then dense woods, and you can't get in there with your marking gun anyway, that you probably, in that case, this is what it's designed for. You can broaden that area, maybe continue it down the rest of the hole, so that players don't have to go in there to find their ball, have the doubt about whether it's in the water or where it ended up. So that's really, I think, especially in Michigan, I think that's how you'll find that to be used most effectively. But that traditional city course that's got the chain link fence around it with streets on the other side, that chain link fence is still more appropriately defined as out of bounds. Again, second corollary to this is an expanded use of these red penalty areas. And so the rules writers are encouraging, where committees want to make more use of red areas, which would provide for that 2 club length relief that isn't available when an area is marked yellow. But certainly, as the slide says, committees remain free to choose what to mark as a penalty area and when to mark a penalty area as yellow, so that if they have an area that they want to maintain traditionally as a hazard that a player needs to play over and make it over, and if they don't, they have to come back and drop behind a hazard, as you currently would in a hazard marked yellow. Committees are still certainly free to do that to protect the challenge or the architecture of that hole. Now, along with that in penalty areas, essentially now, the procedure in penalty areas for what you can touch, move, or do will be the same as it will be in the general area. In other words, when the player crosses that red line right now, as you know, they can't ground their club, they can't move loose impediments, they can't test the condition of the hazard, can they? Well, now in 2019, they'll be able to do anything to the left of that red line that they can do to the right of that red line. They'll be able to move loose impediments, they'll be able to ground their club, they'll be able to make practice swings. They'll be able to test if they want to, put their hand down, put their hand in the water, whatever they choose to do. And so this certainly will be a significant change to the rules. So left of the red line, right of the red line, no difference. Yes, sir?
So you were talking before about lost balls and provisionals and going back. Could a golf course that had native grass areas along the entire outside edges, or woods, holes that are lined with woods, could they mark that as a lateral hazard the whole way, and that be the rule for that golf course?
Yes, sir. And so that, again, so that'll be the committee's discretion, and that will be called now a red penalty area. And they've taken the word water out of that equation in terms of how it's defined, since it's called penalty area. And that's an excellent example. Those thick native grasses, even though there's no water in there, currently you would say, hey, that's not a lateral water hazard, but now, so you wait 1 year, and that's perfect, because now you'll be able to speed up play. It will be interesting, and I don't think there's been a lot of discussion about this. I think it'll be interesting to see what it does to scoring averages at particular clubs or courses, where now, at your facility, they're going back under stroke and distance, aren't they? And maybe several times during the round, where now they're going to save themselves their distance, they'll still have the stroke. So absolutely. And too, I'd be willing to do this once we get to 2019. If you want me to come back here and some of you have specific questions, once you start to think about it and you bring me pictures or something, I'll be happy to look at that and tell you, hey, this would be a good idea, you should do this, or if you like, I'd be happy to help you with it, with the thinking on it. But yeah, that's perfect. Is that Jeff in the back there? Hi, Jeff.
To play along with that, is where currently we have out of bounds. Now, could we go red there and then that'll help speed up play so you're gonna have stroke and distance?
Yes, and like I say, I think that really as the thinking is, let me give you an example. Here you've got a lot of cases where your boundary to the side of the boundary, you've got thick wooded areas. And so I think that that's probably appropriate. Conversely, I know Keith isn't here this morning from Kent, but you take the right side of number 4 at Kent with a chain link fence, I think they're still better to just make that out. That's out of bounds. That's really, now, could they mark it red? Yes, but I don't think that's really what's contemplated in the discussion. But certainly in these cases where you have the heavy wooded areas, maybe a few little scattered ponds in there, that this more liberal use of red is appropriate. Yep, appropriate. And again, yes, sir?
Any changes to the interior out of bounds?
There's no change to the concept of interior boundaries if you still feel that they're appropriate. In other words, if you have a practice area that you feel needs to be marked internally as out of bounds, it will still be appropriate to do that. Yes, yeah. Or not. Again, it's the committee's discretion.
Things are changing.
You know, this is, again, you can all appreciate this, and I had an official from the USGA and the RNA talk to me as early as about 2010 about this. We had this conversation about what if players could move loose impediments in a bunker. You know, and I thought, well, gosh, that isn't very traditional. And because I'm kind of a traditional guy when it comes to the rules. So that's Jim.
Your wheelhouse is changing, buddy.
So, anyway, you know, I thought, well, that isn't very traditional. And then they both said to me, sort of simultaneously, well, when was the last time you saw a pine cone in a bunker? When was the last time you saw a leaf in a bunker? And I thought, boy, you know what? You're right, and you never see them anymore. So these little leaves in this bunker, hey, they don't belong here, do they? So things have changed so much. By the way, I had to put this in from old Tom Morris. Bunkers are not a place for pleasure. They're a place for punishment and repentance. So, but they're not that way anymore, are they? And so these two gentlemen convinced me that, hey, when was the last time you saw a leaf in a bunker or a pine cone in a bunker? And I said, you know, I guess I haven't. They're so perfect now. They're just so perfect. So you all get credit for this rules change, which is moving or touching loose impediments or touching sand in the bunker. So here's how this will change for bunkers. Players will now, as of 2019, be able to move loose impediments in bunkers and touch the sand with some limited restrictions, meaning that if you accidentally dropped your club and caught it and the club head was touching the sand, that sort of accidental activity would not be a penalty. You probably are all aware that there are, and this is one of the reasons for the change, is that although the rule certainly has 3 main prohibitions, and those are what? That you don't do what? You don't test the condition of the hazard, you don't touch ground in the hazard or water in a water hazard with your hand or a club, and you don't move loose impediments. And we all grew up learning those 3 things. But there are so many notes and exceptions at the end of that rule that permit you to do a lot of different things that the rule has really evolved into full of notes and exceptions. If you fall and touch the ground, there's no penalty. If you move an obstruction, if you mark a ball, there's all kinds of times when you touch the hazard and you're not penalized. You can even place your clubs in the hazard, and that's okay under the current rule. So now what's designed to happen is really what a player will be limited to is no testing with hand or a club. That'll still be prohibited. Touching the sand right in front of or right behind the ball in addressing the ball or making the backswing will still be prohibited. And touching the sand and making a practice swing will still be prohibited. And this was primarily an agronomic consideration in that if you can picture players making many practice swings in your bunkers near your putting greens, that this would easily deposit a lot of sand on putting greens. And so this really wasn't something that the governing body were interested in having happen. But touching and moving loose impediments now will be okay. Just don't test, ground the club right in front of or behind the ball, or make practice swings. Along with this, another option under the employable ball rule for a ball in a bunker will provide for this. I think most of you are aware, let's say that this player's ball is right up under the lip of this bunker, right here, closest to the green, right there. I think most of you are aware that if the player deems the ball unplayable under the unplayable ball rule, that they have three options. They could go back to the spot of the previous stroke, wherever that might be, and that would get them outside the bunker, assuming the previous stroke was from outside the bunker. They can measure 2 club lengths, but if they measure 2 club lengths, they have to stay in the bunker. Or they can come back on this red line currently, but if they come back, they have to stay in the bunker. Now those options will still be available for 1 penalty stroke, but as sort of in the modernization process, as a sort of a last resort, there's a provision now for a 2-stroke penalty for coming out of the bunker. Essentially what you're doing is you're getting a penalty stroke under the employable ball rule and 1 more penalty stroke for the sort of luxury of being able to come out and drop the ball. And I suspect, and I was in on a little of the discussion of this, that this will really be a last resort. For example, the player whose ball is embedded right in the lip here and makes 1 stroke at it and drives it deeper into the bunker. Well, where's the spot of the previous stroke if they want to proceed under stroke and distance? Well, it's right there. So now they've lost the chance to get out of the bunker under stroke and distance. And the other options sort of keep them in the bunker and maybe don't offer anything practical. So for a total of 2 penalty strokes, they'll be able to come out essentially on the line, and that's what the new wording will say, this back on a line procedure for 2 penalty strokes. Okay, a couple more changes and then we'll have a break. Really the final change here, and some of you are familiar with this, and this of course has had an evolution over time as well. Now in 2019, essentially, once the player takes a stance for the stroke to be made, the caddy cannot be positioned behind the player. So the caddy now can help the player with the yardage, can help the player with the direction, but once the player moves into position to take their stance for the stroke to be made, the caddy cannot be on an extension of the line of play behind the ball. Most of you are aware this seems to, for whatever reason, take place most commonly right now on the LPGA Tour, where tour caddies get their players lined up and actually spend quite a bit of time on this extension of the line of play behind the ball, talking to their player, getting them comfortable, or whatever it is that they're doing. This will now be a breach of the rules. There's a little bit of a refinement to it on the putting green, and that the caddy will still be able to stand on the putting green while the player takes their stance, but will then have to move out of the way. And of course, some of you recall, in the evolution of this rule, one of the reasons that the rule changed when it did in the early 1980s was Johnny Miller had a practice when he was winning all those tournaments out west, especially when he went early in the season. His caddy, Andy Martinez, would always stand directly behind Johnny while he was putting and stay there while he was putting, and for whatever reason, to shield him from the gallery or whatever it was. But that obviously was prohibited starting in the early 1980s, so the rule certainly has had an evolution. I've never been bothered by this personally. Some of you may be, but certainly some of the discussion is that really players certainly are entitled to be assisted by their caddies, and this is still a part of the rules. Players can get yardage, players can get swing advice, but the actual physically lining up to play the stroke, the governing bodies have decided, hey, you know what? This is up to the player to be able to do by themselves without the assistance of the caddy. And so this really undermines the players' needs to use their own judgment or skill. Some people also feel it's a pace of play issue, and it may be to some extent. And some people have just been so bothered by the look, especially people in positions to make decisions with respect to what's going to happen, that they've decided that once a player gets into position to make a stroke, that caddy will not be able to be behind the player. Okay, so that's what I've got, and if there are any other questions, I'll be happy to take them now. Yes, sir.
So back to the native grass areas
Yep.
and woods, and of course deem them to be lateral hazards. Do they have to mark that with red paint throughout the entire golf course, or can that just be their rule that if you're in one of those areas, you get a drop with with a stroke penalty?
Yeah, they'll still need to be defined in some way, and so it wouldn't have to be with red paint, but it could certainly be by use of red stakes. But again, for being able to proceed, because if they're defined that way, then one of the choices that the player will have will be to measure 2 club lengths from the point where the ball last crossed the edge of that penalty area, that red penalty area, and they'll have to be able to proceed by knowing where that reference point is. But that could certainly be done by use of stakes. Now, I will say this, that you may get your wish, in that I know there's been some discussion to this effect, that there may be certain features or characteristics that are so distinguishing of an area. For example, like a distinguishing certain grass line or cut, that you may end up getting your wish. So if you wait till next week, you may find out that will suffice. But I'm not positive. You may still need to use the stakes or lines, but you may end up being able to do it by certain special distinguishing features of the area. Yes?
I have a question. On embedded ball, you talked about, a lot of times when we play local rules, it's pick, clean, and place. When you talk about anything about cleaning, will you still pick an embedded ball? You're going to still stick it down dirty? Make the players hit it?
Okay, so embedded ball. Under the current embedded ball rule, the only thing that will change about the embedded ball rule is where we use it under the rules. So it'll be fairway and rough as a part of the rules. But secondly, under the current rule, when you lift your embedded ball, you're cleaning it and then dropping it. So nothing will change there. You'll still be able to clean it, and you'll be able to drop it, and you'll be able to drop it in a bigger area. Again, I'm not sure how big that area will be. Maybe as much as a club length, but again, you'll know by next week. Yes, sir?
When you use the term general area, is that going to be defined by height of cut?
General area, so currently, the term through the green, the definition through the green. Through the green, in the rules of golf, is the whole area of the course, except the teeing ground of the hole being played, the putting green of the hole being played, and all hazards on the course. So through the green is basically everything except what those exceptions were. The tee, the green, and hazards on the course. Everything else is through the green. So through the green is going to become the general area. I kind of like the term through the green. I guess in the modernization they just wanted something else. So it's the same area as it is right now. So it isn't defined by height of cut, but it won't be the teeing. Actually, the new term will be teeing area. That 2 club length rectangular area will now be called a teeing area rather than teeing ground. It will still be called a putting green, but what's through the green will be called general area. The word hazard will go away. We'll have red and yellow penalty areas, and we'll still have bunkers. We'll still have bunkers. Nope, they won't be traps. They still won't be traps. Sorry, man. Yeah, sir. Jeff.
What was the reason for some of these changes? Was it pace of play, or just to kind of ease up, relax the game a bit?
You know, I would say that some of it has been a response to, you're certainly all aware that everybody involved in golf is trying to grow golf, because golf's been static in terms of the numbers. You know, what do we see that number? 24.5 million people played golf last year, and 24.5 million played golf 20 years ago. So that number hasn't been going up. So part of it's in response to that. Some of it, here's what I think is interesting also. This started out as a project that was called Rules Simplification. And about partway through, they decided that, you know what, the rules are still complicated, and they are. And so it's going to be called Rules Modernization. And there's still, it is designed primarily to eliminate some penalties that people sort of over time thought were, well, hey, maybe a little bit too technical, for example. Just for example, one of the changes that you'll see, currently, you play a stroke, hits a tree and it hits you, you get a one-stroke penalty, either match play or stroke play. That's going to go away. So the governing bodies feel like, hey, you know what? You've taken enough punishment by hitting yourself. Hey, remember, it happened to Jeff Maggart in the Masters, what, about 10 years ago, remember? He was in the lead on that final round on Sunday, and then he really had that bad 12th hole also. Remember that on the third hole, Jeff Maggart played that shot from the fairway bunker and it hit him, he got a penalty stroke. So, but yeah, it's kind of a combination of the modernization and simplification and maybe trying to get more people to understand the rules. Steve Teddams.
What about equipment? Is anything to look at, say the ball's flying farther?
Separately, they're looking at equipment. Obviously, it's tough to roll stuff back once you get a certain way. And I think what's interesting about equipment, and we can all relate to this, is that although certainly at all of the major levels, in fact, the Web.com tour had last year, I think, was the first year for any major tour to have an average driving distance over 300 yards. Average driving distance for the tour. But we don't see it among ourselves, do we? You know, when we go out to play, we're not hitting it that far, and so either is the 15 handicapper. So there's still, it's hard to say what will happen. And those governing bodies are anxious to keep the rules the same for everybody. I mean, that's still, they've made this concession, I think, to see if they could move things along where they wouldn't have to give in other areas. Okay, and I know we're up against time. I don't mean to, but this is good. Go ahead.
Has there been any discussion about the out of bounds rule being not the distance where you could just drop it as a lateral?
Yeah, there certainly was in this process, but they really have decided. You know, there's some situations where, say, out of bounds or ball unplayable, if they turn it into a distance only situation. You know, for example, a player might hit an extremely bad shot on a hole, on a par 3 hole, where maybe they're looking at making a 5 or 6, but instead they just go back to the tee with no penalty, play again, knock it close to hole, and make it 3. And so, again, those are all things that lead into the discussion in terms of what penalties to keep and how proportionate they should be to you know, various situations that take place. You know, how should they really lay out in terms of player scores? So it won't happen. You won't see it next week. That won't be one of the announcements. Yeah.
Mr. Wilson, did you say January 1, 2019?
January 1. So here's the thing: you got to play with the current set of rules. And here's the other thing: so you can all the golf professionals at your facilities. This is going to be really tough. I mean, you're going to have people are going to make at all levels. People are going to make so many mistakes starting January 1 of next year. There's going to be people dropping in the wrong place, not understand arguments. But yeah, you're going to play with the current set of rules for the rest of the year, and then January 1, all these new rules will be in effect. Yes, yeah. So this is just the sneak preview. It really is the sneak preview because, like I say, you'll all see it next week sometime. So you heard it here first.
All right.
Anything else? Okay, well, thank you. This was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting